Okay, I think it's a good time to start. Welcome everyone to our bi-weekly WEFI seminar. Don't have any big announcements. Do look out for an email from us about the student workshop that will be held on May 2nd. The program is almost ready. So Amir, feel free to share your screen. So we're happy to have Amir Sariri here from Purdue. He's got joint work with Ajay Agrawal from Toronto, presenting something on mentorship and startup performance. A reminder on the format before I hand it off. Amir's got 40 minutes. He's going to pause, I don't know, every 7, 10, 12 minutes or so, depending on how it's going. Song and I will watch the chat. If you have any questions, post them in the chat, and then we'll pick, use our discretion to pick those. We may ask you to unmute either during the talk or at the end in the Q&A. And then after the 40, Melanie's going to take the floor and provide a discussion. Then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. So with that, I'm going to hand the floor off to Amir.
All right, thank you very much. Before I start, I just want to apologize in advance. I have some coughs. The good news is that it's not COVID. I got tested twice for that. The bad news is I don't know what it is. It seems like an allergic reaction to something, but I just wanted to apologize in advance that I might be coughing throughout the presentation. Okay. Very delighted to be here today. This project is a joint work with Ajay, and it came out of my dissertation research, actually. So we're very much looking forward to any feedback you might have for us. Also, because it is the first time I'm presenting it, so please leave any comments in the chat or bring them up during the discussion, please. We would really appreciate it. This work looks at whether, how, and when mentorship impacts startup performance. Our motivation is simple, which is the rapid growth in a number of public and private entrepreneurship programs. It is hard to know the precise number of these programs, but we do have valuable early data by Yael Hochberg, Susan Cohen, and others, such as this graph from Hochberg 2016 that shows the fast growth in the number of these programs from 2005 and 2013. There are also earlier work that suggests these patterns in the growth in the number of entrepreneurship programs, and this graph doesn't even include university-based programs that I presume most of us have heard of in our own institutions. On top of that, quick search and public grants really show that there continues to be public investments made in the creation of these programs, such as the U.S. Department of Transportation funding for infrastructure-related accelerators, or the FAST partnership funding provided by Small Business Innovation Research that started in 2014 and has alone distributed over $15 million to more than 200 accelerators so far. However, accelerators are often composite programs with different kinds of offering, which motivates investigating which kinds of these services are actually useful and contribute to the success of the entrepreneurs. In terms of non-financial services, mentorship is really a defining and perhaps the most salient feature of these programs. Cohen and colleagues reporting their sample of 146 accelerators, 90% provide mentorship by external parties, more than any other type of service, which is also consistent with other survey-based studies that we have that show entrepreneurs also report mentorship as the most valuable feature of these programs. But the performance implications of mentorship, and especially mentorship provided by accelerators, are not really well understood and studied. There are multiple lines of research on, or at least recognizing, the performance implications of mentorship. And at the same time, there is also small but growing literature on design features of these accelerators and their impact on regional economies. But what is scarce is a systematic empirical evidence on whether these programs have an impact, or the mentorship aspect of these programs have an impact on startup success. Of course, with the exception of the 2020 worksite paper by Hallen, Cohen, and Bingham, even though in their case, they don't measure the intensity of mentorship, but but they do offer compelling qualitative evidence suggesting that mentorship may be a key driver of gains from participating in accelerators. Okay, what are research questions? The overarching research question, as you might have guessed, is does business mentorship impact startup performance? We offer causal evidence for that. We argue for a causal interpretation because of a number of reasons. One of them is that we have deep institutional knowledge about the data generating process, about how this program works, different channels through which the program could impact the performance of the startups. We have extensive controls for each of the startups in our program before they join the program, during their participation, as well as after they leave. And we also offer instrumental variable results. We have an IV that we're feedback on that as well. In terms of the impact of mentorship, a question is whether this impact is uniform more or less across startups. We find that there is large variation across startups in terms of the performance impact. And a natural question that arises is whether this impact has to do with entrepreneurs getting benefits through accessing social networks of these mentors that they're in contact with, or getting capital from them, as opposed to learning, which is presumably the main object of mentorship. But we do offer causal evidence of mentorship driving learning, specifically in the context of learning how to set business priorities for these companies. The next question we ask is, if mentorship has an impact on performance via learning, then we should observe that those entrepreneurs that learn faster perform better. And we do find evidence consistent with that, which we're going to show you. And the final question that we ask is whether founders learn how to learn from mentors. If fast learners are the ones that are benefiting the most from mentorship, then could mentors teach entrepreneurs how to learn? In other words, bend the learning curve for them. And we cannot find any evidence supporting that idea. Our interpretation is that fast learners are born, not made, at least in the context of our research, which is equivalent to the argument of nature versus nurture, which in our case favors nature as opposed to nurture. Okay. Before I give you the outline, let me take a quick pause here, see if there are any questions, any clarifying questions.
Not yet. Everything.
All right, great.
Everybody.
So what I'm going to show you for the rest of the presentation is, first I'm gonna share what we know about mentorship and propensity to learn in entrepreneurial settings and in other settings as well. Then I will present the empirical setting as well as the data. And then I've divided the results into two sections. First, I'm going to show you the results on the performance impact, and then I'll show you the results on learning. And I'll close by sharing our contributions and some directions for future research. The interest in mentorship really goes beyond a service provided by accelerators. Others have looked at mentoring role of investors, educators, peers, and of course, mentorship programs as well. Those studies that do focus on performance impact of accelerators attribute the gains, as I briefly mentioned before, attribute the gains to learning via mentorship rather than standard business education and other financial or extra financial support. However, at the venture level, the studies that we have on entrepreneurial learning specifically use proxies such as experience as binary indicators of whether the entrepreneur has learned a bundle of business skills rather than the explicit and temporal process of information acquisition and skill development. Aldrich and Yang really nicely articulate the importance of learning, and specifically speed of learning in entrepreneurship, which I quote directly from their 2014 paper. They say, From a learning perspective, the study of entrepreneurial actions during the founding process concerns whether humans learn quickly enough to sustain their emerging ventures on a path to stability. Nascent entrepreneurs learning slowly or not at all are more likely to fail. Understanding contributions of habits, heuristics, and learning over the life course gives us insights into how well nascent entrepreneurs cope with the problems involved in building organizational routines, either adapting or being selected out. What we do know about entrepreneurial learning is that there is significant variation in entrepreneurs' propensity to learn. For example, younger and female founders adjust their beliefs in response to feedback more. But although the variation in learning is studied in other contexts, we don't really know much about its implications for entrepreneurial process and entrepreneurial success. And this matters not only because we care about venture success as a driver of growth, but also because if mentorship does in fact drive performance by learning, then public and private investments made in accelerators could yield high return if these programs could screen based on things such as entrepreneurs' propensity to learn. We have an excellent setting and a rich database to address these issues. Our data comes from a global entrepreneurship program called Creative Destruction Lab, which is a nonprofit organization that runs at business schools in Canada, US, and Europe. It has a lot of moving parts, but I just pick 3 or 4 pieces of detail that are important to the present study, but I'm happy to answer any other questions you might have. It is a 9-month program that caters to early stage high-tech startups. Some call them science-based startups, but I'm just going to stick with high-tech for the time being. Typically, the type of startups that are founded by faculty and graduate students. It consists of 4 in-person meetings that are 8 weeks apart. And there's a, I'm sorry, there is a 5th meeting where startups graduate. The purpose of these meetings is for the entrepreneurs to propose, discuss, and finalize 3 business objectives to focus on at the expense of everything else over the subsequent 8 weeks. So this is a process that keeps happening where the ideal goal for these meetings is that entrepreneurs leave each of these in-person meetings with a set of objectives to focus on. A feature of this process that is important for our study is that within a week before this in-person meeting that happens in the business school, all founders must propose the objectives that they think are the things that are most important for their business and submit them directly to the program for partly the same reason we want our students to do the required readings before coming to the class. On the meeting day, they get one-on-one feedback on their proposed objectives from 4 to 5 mentors. So they're small meetings that are happening in study rooms across the building where they get one-on-one feedback from mentors. Here's an example. So there's a dossier that is produced in advance of each of these meetings distributed to the mentors, and a section on that dossier has the proposed objectives by the founders. Here you see they suggested that they're open their Series A round. There's an objective about revenue, and there's an objective that is operational in nature. And this is an example of an actual meeting. I barged in and took this shot because I kind of needed it for my research. Then after these meetings are done in the morning, usually in the afternoon, all the mentors convene in a large room where they see startups again, but one at a time, to debate and reconcile this private feedback that they got in the morning. And the outcome is that founders and mentors together have to finalize those 3 objectives that the founders should achieve or focus on over the next 8 weeks. And there's a moderator, usually a business school professor, who ensures that this happens. So they keep time and make sure that if they're towards the end of the meeting, everybody focuses on just finalizing the objectives so that entrepreneurs leave with those objectives. Here's an example of that. So this is the finalized equivalent of those proposed objectives that I showed you. So the only one of these three objectives that remain is the revenue one, but the other two objectives changed. So mentors said something along the lines of, this is too early, you shouldn't raise money right now, you should focus on other stuff, something along those lines. The entrepreneur, as you can see, is in the middle. You've got mentors in the first couple of rows. You can probably, if you squint hard enough, you're going to see me right there in the corner taking notes, and two other PhD students and a bunch of MD students all around the room. But my role there was to just get as much data as I can for this project and a few other projects. Okay, the final piece of detail that you should know is that there is mentorship happening on the day of, and there is mentorship happening in between sessions. So once all startups finalize your objectives, mentors choose which startups they wish to personally advise over the next 8 weeks during that off period, where each expression of interest costs them 4 hours. So they're informed every single time they come to these meetings that if you raise your hand for a venture, you have to commit 4 hours of your time. And it is enforced by the staff. And if somebody doesn't honor their commitment, they get an angry message from the program directors. And you know how business professors are when they get angry. So they actually might not get invited back to the program if they keep missing their commitments. And ventures that don't receive any interest are cut from the program, which is the reason for the attrition that you see over across these sessions or meetings. Okay. This is an example of that's the end of the day. The moderator goes through the list from top to bottom, says venture one, who's interested. And in this case, these three mentors raise your hand. So 2 at the top and 1 at the bottom. Somebody takes notes, writes down their names, and makes sure that the mentor and the entrepreneur get connected and schedule a meeting immediately after, like the day after the in-person meetings are over. Okay, our data comes from the 2018-2019 cohort, where we have 289 startups from a variety of technology domains. We have a total of 3,688 objectives, half of which are proposed and the other half is finalized. And there are 262 mentors who on average spend 25 hours mentoring startups and attend between 2 to 3 of these meetings. This last piece, the fact that they don't attend all the meetings, is the foundation of our instrumental variable that I'm going to discuss in more detail later on. Okay, the key measures you should know, we have 2 dependent variables, one for performance, measuring performance, and one for measuring learning. Our 3 dependent variables for performance are whether the company raised $100,000 or more 3 years after participating in the program. The second dependent variable is the total amount of money they raised over the course of 3 years after leaving the program. And the last one is the latest valuation of the company based on their last funding round. For learning, we look at changes in the fraction of important business objectives that they correctly predict. In other words, the precision of their priors. You remember they proposed objectives and then they finalized it. Somebody who correctly predicted all 3 objectives would get a value of 1 here. That's the true positives on top. And somebody who didn't predict anything would get a value of 0. And the denominator are total objectives, which in this case is 3 for all the ventures. The main independent variable is the hours of mentorship that they received. So for performance regressions, because it's at the cross section, we look at the total hours of mentorship that they received over the course of participating in the 2018-2019 program. And for learning regressions, because we used the panel data in that case, we used the cumulative hours of mentorship they received before making their next prediction, next period's prediction. Okay, as I mentioned, we have a ton of information on large set of venture characteristics. Here are probably the most important ones that we've identified, but I'm just gonna highlight a few. First of all, the average startup has around $470,000 in funding before coming to the program. Of course, that is largely driven by outliers that might have raised a few $1,000,000. Those companies usually get cut because they're not a good fit for the program, but nevertheless, this is the mean. The mean grant is $300,000, give or take, which speaks to the science-based or technology-based nature of these startups. The average founding team is 34 years old. Average founding team age is 34, and more than half of the founding teams have at least one PhD founder. At the same time, there's less than 40% of these founding teams who have at least one founder with an undergraduate or master's business degree. Another point speaking to the high-tech nature of these companies is that around 70% of them pursue a patent strategy for protecting their IP. In terms of dependent variables, roughly 30% raise more than $100,000 3 years after the program. And on average, they raise about $1 million, and the pre-money valuation is on average $3.5 million. And the pre-money valuation is the valuation of the company before the investment, the cash is injected in the company. In terms of the dependent variable for learning, that precision measure that I described earlier, the average is 0.45, which means that entrepreneurs get on average less than half of their objectives correct. Okay, let me stop here again to see if there are any questions. I hope this means it's perfectly clear.
I'm understanding everything, and
all right,
I'm
great.
in the room, so it's great.
Awesome. Okay. Let me show you a couple of statistics on the mentors. We have 260 mentors. The majority are VCs, general partners of VCs, and have some past entrepreneurial experience, but a much smaller fraction are angels, and around 44% of the mentors are successful ex-entrepreneurs, exited ex-entrepreneurs. A feature that, as I mentioned, underlies the construction of our instrumental variable is the fact that mentors do not attend all of these meetings. You can imagine these are busy people. They have other commitments. On average, they attend between 2 to 3 of the meetings, which I'm going to explain how we are going to exploit this for constructing our instrumental variable. Okay, for our estimation model, we use a Poisson regression for estimating the impact of mentorship on amount of capital raised and valuation, and a linear regression for the impact of mentorship on a probability of raising more than $100,000. The X here, mentorship, is the total number of hours of mentorship that they received. X is a vector of controls, some of which I showed in an earlier slide. The gamma is indicators for the program location. These programs run out of business schools, so they mostly draw on their local network of investors, mentors, startups, and that could have an impact on both mentorship and the performance of these startups. So we include dummies for that. We include indicator variables for the core technology of these companies, and the last set of indicators is for the number of meetings participated. So the longer a company were part of the program, the more mentorship they receive, obviously important. So we include a dummy variable for that as well. Okay, here is the first set of results. This is the 3 graphs on top show the estimated the data for mentorship hours for each of the 3 dependent variables. The one on the left has raised more than $100,000 estimated using OLS, and you've got funding as a second dependent variable and valuation as a third dependent variable. We have here, I've not shown the controls. I'm happy to show that as well. I've got it here, but an extra hour of mentorship is associated with roughly 3% increase in the probability of raising a seed or later stage funding. 8% more capital in valuation. To put that in context, it means around $84,000 more for a company that has $1 million in funding, and about $24,000 for a startup, for the average startup, in terms of all the characteristics that we have in our regression, which is a pretty meaningful number in our view. Okay, let me tell you how we construct our IB strategy. For the IB, we exploit randomness in mentors' scheduling conflicts that make them unable to attend these in-person meetings. For the intuition, you should know two facts. One is that mentors must be physically present in the room, the big room that I showed a picture of, in order to commit time to startups. Fact number two is that mentor absence affects different startups differently in terms of how much time they get from the mentors, the amount of commitment that they get at the end of the day. And that is because startups are more likely to get commitment from their existing mentors than people who haven't met them before, presumably because learning is costly. You gotta learn a lot about the venture and the founders in order to give them meaningful advice. So if I'm a venture who's missing 2 out of 3 existing mentors, I'm worse off more than somebody who's missing those 2 mentors, but those 2 mentors have never spent time with that venture. So that is really the intuition. This is just the math stuff or the formal description of the same thing. The only thing that I'm gonna describe here, in addition to the main instrument, which is W, is Z. Z is really the total number of mentors available in that big room. So the stock of mentors available. There are each startup, each subset of roughly 20 startups goes to a different room, and that room has its own set of mentors. So the variation stock of mentors affects a group of startups, but not the other startups. It's not, this variable is not identified at the venture level, but it captures variation at the room level. So we use the interaction of these 2 instruments as a third instrument, which is also valid. The last thing I would mention here is that one concern is that mentor attendance or rate of attendance would have some sort of pattern over time. For example, you can imagine if lower quality ventures get dropped earlier in the program, then the mentors will start focusing on the later stage meetings, 3rd or 4th, 5th meeting. They would come to those, but we check that, and both at the overall program level, but also at the site level and track level, those rooms, and we don't see any discernible pattern. Okay. Let me see what I can. Let me stop here, see if there are any questions.
No, I think we're good.
Okay, awesome.
I'll interrupt you if there's a big question.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Okay, let's look at the IB results. Column 1 shows the first stage, and column 2 through 4 show coefficient estimates for mentorship for each of the 3 dependent variables. Column 2 is raised more than 100,000, 3 is external funding, and 4 is latest valuation. We find the bottom line is that the estimates are very consistent, and as expected, slightly larger and more precisely estimated than the other estimates that I showed earlier. We perform a number of tests to assess the performance of our instrument, either under identification or identification, weak identification. I'm not going to bore you with that detail, but happy to discuss if there are any questions on that. Okay, let's look at learning. This is the model for estimating the impact of mentorship on learning. Our DV here is precision, as I mentioned before, and the main independent variable is cumulative hours of mentorship before the next instance of mentorship. So that's this variable over here. We have a new control variable, cohort size, because there's attrition. There are more mentors on average available. Stock of mentorship increases per venture as we progress towards the later meeting. So we control for the number of startups remaining in that cohort or in that room, that particular room over time. Then we have the startup fixed effects, as well as indicator variables for the type of objective that startups proposed for each period. This last series of indicators is really important, that the task category of objectives, because it accounts for the fact that some business objectives are more frequent by nature and are easier to correctly predict than others. They're developed a classification system in an earlier project that I brought here, where we categorize all of these objectives, and we use dummy variables to control for the nature of the objectives. Okay, here you can see the plotted coefficients for both full sample of startups on the left. So that's the on balance panel. With startups, getting dropped out of the program. And on the right-hand side, you're going to see the balance panel, which includes only startups that were not cut from the program and attended an equal number of in-person meetings all the way through to the end. The red dot is the estimate from the OLS, and the blue dot is IV estimates. The bottom line here is that you see the estimates are pretty consistent and significant across the board. Again, IV estimates are a little larger and more precise. So the interpretation is that an extra hour of mentorship is associated with roughly 1 to 2% increase in founder precision. This might seem an insignificant magnitude, but remember that startups are getting at least 4 hours of mentorship time per period. And the average startup receives 8 to 10 hours of mentorship during each of those 8-hour period. And on top of that, just beyond our empirical setting, it is hard to imagine a founder could call somebody mentor unless they're spending meaningful chunk of time together. So hopefully more than an hour. Let me tell you how we construct our subsamples for high learners, fast learners, and low learners. We have designed a procedure for that. Love your feedback on it, but let me explain how we do this. First, we create 4 subsamples based on the number of in-person meetings that these companies attended. So this 42 of the startups, for example, made a prediction and they were cut from the program. They didn't come back a second time. And then we have 54 ventures that came back 2 times, 82, and the set of startups that went all the way through the program is 111. Then we look at the distribution of each of these subsamples' last prediction, the precision of the last prediction that entrepreneurs made within each of these subsamples, and then divide each subsample into 2 groups around the median. So now for each of the 4 subsamples, we have a group of startups that made great predictions just before they left the last time they were seen, and the rest who made poor predictions. Next, we group the startups with great predictions together and startups with bad predictions together. So that gives us the highly precise group and then not so great group of entrepreneurs. So these people on the right side of the median line are grouped together. The people on the left are grouped together. The reason we go through this process, as opposed to, you can imagine, just dividing the entire sample by the median precision, is that doing so will put startups that were cut early, mostly in the bad category, and the majority of startups that survive longer in the good category. We don't want that. We want to find good and bad predictors conditional on the duration of participation in the accelerator and the duration of exposure they had to mentorship through the program. The last step is that we plot the average precision of each group in earlier prediction instances. So this all was based on the last prediction they made. We'll look at their predictions in earlier instances in earlier sessions. What we expected to see was those who made great predictions were meaningfully better from the beginning, but we instead saw this. It appears that most precise entrepreneurs were making just as poor predictions early on, specifically over the first couple of meetings, but it seems like they picked up this particular skill faster and distanced themselves from the imprecise group. And in other words, the precise group seems to have learned faster. Then we look at whether those entrepreneurs who appear to have learned faster actually gained from mentorship more than those entrepreneurs that seem not be picking up much in terms of prioritizing their objectives. So on the left side, the left panel of this plot, you have the sample of low learners, and then right plot, you have the sample of high learners. On the x-axis, you have the average mentorship they received, and on the y-axis, you have one of our dependent variables, capital raised. In our regressions, we check all the dependent variables, and what we see is that it seems like the low learners aren't really getting much out of their mentorship, whereas the high learners are benefiting the most. We also run a lot of robustness checks, getting rid of this, outlier over here. We in fact look at the same regressions, eliminating all startups that have raised more than $10 million and more than $30 million. The results are consistent across the board.
Amir, quick question from the audience. Aubrey was asking about whether the founders and mentors interact more than the 8 hours, somehow outside of the standard setting. I suppose if so, how should we interpret the results?
Right. Yeah, it is possible that they do. I remember I said we have deep institutional knowledge from the setting. From 4 years or 5 years that I've been observing this process, it's very rare that happens. Again, these are very busy individuals. What usually happens is that somebody has to keep emailing them and make sure that the meeting does take place. There's something on their calendar and they honor their commitment. That happens more often than interactions. Although it is certainly possible if one of the mentors makes an investment in the company, it is obviously going to be an ongoing relationship between the investor and the entrepreneur. And we do not have a way of capturing that at the moment.
I mean, what I wanted to say very briefly is that mentoring, we usually think of something that happens over time. This could be actually like a short course with industry people, what we would call a short course with industry people, as opposed to long-term mentoring. So that's in terms, like Michael said, what is the interpretation of the results regarding mentoring?
Right. That's a great point. The mentoring here is very clearly defined, which is mentoring entrepreneurs how to set objectives. And I agree with you that mentoring goes well beyond just teaching entrepreneurs how to set objectives. But we do focus on this because we can clearly measure it, and it speaks to learning, which is what we are interested in. But I agree with you 100% on that point. Okay, the last result that I'm going to show you is that the last question we asked was whether fast learners are born or raised. It's an old question, not specifically fast learners, but great entrepreneurs are born or raised. We asked an analog of that question, which is whether fast learners are born or raised. So we test if higher mentorship intensity, more hours, is associated with being a high learner. But we don't find any discernible evidence for that. So that's column 1 here. This regression has all the full set of controls and fixed effects. The dependent variable is mentorship hours, and the independent variable is mentorship hours, and the dependent variable is whether the entrepreneur was in the high learner category, and we don't see much going on here. Now, if being a fast learner is nature, then mentors could identify that and disproportionately select into mentoring fast learners. We test for that as well, but we see that being a high learner does not predict, at least in a significant way, the mentorship hours that the startups receive. In fact, we find that the low learners on average get more mentorship hours than the fast learners, which is not in a way surprising because they might need more support in building their business. Okay, I have 2 minutes left. I'm just going to run through the contributions and the future for research, directions for future research. The contribution number one is that these results complement other studies that looked at mentorship by investors, peers, teachers, supervisors. So that's the first point. We believe that these are some of the first evidence really on an old question of are great entrepreneurs born or raised in the context of learning specifically. We recognize the fact that success is in an important way a function of the choices that entrepreneurs make. And these decision-making skills based on results can be learned via mentorship. But the impact seems to depend seemingly on some inherent qualities of the entrepreneurs. In terms of policy implications, historically, there are these policies that offer financial incentives to attract flow of capital to regions, but they don't really pay much attention to non-financial value-added attributes that these investors could bring with them to their region. And the one of them that I think policymakers should care about is the capacity to mentor early-stage entrepreneurs. For accelerators, I mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation. It seems like being able to screen, at least partly based on propensity to learn, could contribute to the returns that they get from the time and money they invest in these programs. And for entrepreneurs, there's just a one-liner: benefits from mentorship and advice are not automatic. In terms of future research, one point is that even if propensity to learn is completely inherent, building a business is really an individual endeavor. So what are the implications for team composition, complementarities between skill and ability of the founding teams? There's things that I think should be studied. The willingness to learn or learning ability, that's something we can't really distinguish in our study, which would be something that is important to be looked at. And there are two directions for future research arising from the limited, from the features of our sample. First of all, our sample is restricted to scalable high-tech startups. That's not all of entrepreneurship. There are small local businesses, family businesses, and those people also get mentorship. So that's something to be looked at. And finally, mentors in our sample are usually high-profile individuals who are active investors and ex-entrepreneurs, but business school professors also provide mentorship and advice. And I think those things have not been studied as much. And that is pretty much it. And I didn't cough as much. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Amir, for a clear and insightful presentation. So Melanie Wallskog is our discussant. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Should you all see that?
Yeah, looks good.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, awesome. So thank you so much for having me. Super excited to read this paper and get to talk about it. Amir, great presentation. Obviously, all free disposal. And if you have any questions, we can talk afterwards and everything. So I wanted to start by kind of laying out what I see to be the main strengths of the paper. Mentorship and startup performance is certainly a really important and really difficult to study topic. So I think that's important. And the authors are going to have some plausibly exogenous variation in mentorship, which is kind of key and, obviously not often there. The last thing I think is that this is kind of a super intuitive story that the authors are presenting, which I think is helpful. We see these mentors, they're there to improve task prioritization. They seem to do that. And then that improves performance. And so it's always helpful when things seem intuitive. What I'm going to do, though, with the rest of my time is kind of talk about a couple of, suggestions that are both first on measurement and then on interpretation. And these are going to be, partially, I'll try to say some concrete things that I think you could do empirically, but also I think some of it might just reflect kind of how the narrative could be, shaped a little bit more. The first issue, which I think is partially answered in your talk, so I think maybe might just be kind of including some of those details in the paper, is I struggled a bit to think about how, or kind of what exactly does higher precision mean in the context of kind of, this is a setting where people are trying to improve their task prioritization, and it wasn't clear to me whether that meant that the mentors are really there to kind of say, here are your 3 tasks, do them, or if it's kind of, right, are we thinking about learning how to develop skills to know how to prioritize tasks? The split by high versus low learning is kind of trying to get at that, the idea, right, that it's, some people are kind of ready to learn in that case, but it's not immediately clear to me kind of exactly what's happening in these settings. Now, the second point I have there is actually, I think, moot, because I think from the paper, it wasn't clear to me that you only got to choose 3 tasks to prioritize. So I had been wondering of like, were some people just prioritizing 15 tasks and then their mentors were really saying, oh no, you need to really narrow it down. That's not going to be relevant here. But I think kind of and I think this is honestly just going to be narrative, is it's not obvious to the reader kind of, are the mentors there to kind of say, here are the tasks to prioritize this time? Are they there to say, here's the life cycle of tasks, the next 2 months you're working on this, the next 2 months after that. And so should we just expect, higher precision over time because they've already laid out their path? And so all of that is to say, I think that there's not anything super empirically concrete to do there, but I think maybe sharpening that a little bit in the paper would be helpful. The second thing on measurement, though, is I want to talk a little bit about the IV regressions, and specifically thinking about who the compliers are in those regressions. So kind of first in the traditional sense of kind of the late, we're thinking about, I guess, just to remind you, the key instrument is going to be the number of times your existing mentors are basically in your sessions, right? Because there's path dependence. And so if a lot of your former mentors are there, you're more likely to get more mentorship hours after a given group session. But when we think about kind of the compliers of kind of for whom is having that greater set of former mentors there, how does that predict, future mentorship hours? What exactly is that group? Is it the ones who are not very popular, so they're not, going to be raking in new mentors? Is it the ones who are super popular because they have lots of former mentors there? Is it that the ones that were kind of their former mentors liked them enough, and so trying to think just through kind of exactly what the selection is into the complier group. More broadly, it wasn't super clear to me in the paper, and I think, again, just this might be a narrative of kind of who exactly are the mentors who have the variable scheduling conflicts. The authors nicely showed that, the mentor attendance is more or less fixed over time, but it wasn't clear to me of, well, obviously some of them are going to have variable attendance. Is it the super busy active ones who would be great mentors? Is it the ones who maybe get discouraged? Since it doesn't sound like the authors have kind of data on their actual calendars. It's not like, oh, this person had a dentist appointment, they can't make it. Instead, there could be endogenous exit, and maybe on average it doesn't change over time, but maybe it's changing over time in a selected way. So I think just kind of shoring up exactly and thinking about what the I guess compliers are in the 2SLS would be helpful for the reader. More broadly, and getting to, I guess, a couple of empirical suggestions, I want to talk about interpretation and the mechanisms. The authors kind of nicely say, right, so having these mentors predicts that you're going to be more, I guess, higher valuation, higher investment, higher capital raised. And then they provide this, hypothesis that this is operating through the mechanism of learning. You're learning you're basically becoming more precise in how you set your task priorities. There we go. Hard to say. But then kind of, I don't think that they can really benchmark that against other mechanisms. And I think that would be really helpful if that could happen. So first, I think something super, super simple, just in an accounting sense, would be to kind of say, okay, let's take what's your precision predicted by your mentorship hours. And then if we regress your kind of end financing and valuation on that precision, what is the R squared? Just kind of get a sense of, are we talking about, yes, there's a link between mentorship and precision. How much does that actually matter when we go over to think about the differences in financing? It could be that it doesn't really matter. You still have variation there. It could be that it matters a lot. And I think that would be helpful. More explicitly, I think that if there's any way to kind of think about other mechanisms, that would be really helpful. Immediately when I'm reading this, and I think you mentioned it a little bit in the talk, you could very much have the case that the mentors are just directly connecting the startups with financing, in which case, how do we think about that, affecting, how do we think about that in terms of saying something about mentorship in general? Is it mentorship that's really just about networking versus actually this learning channel. So one thing you could do, if you have the data, would be to look and see whether the source of the financing depends on the mentorship hours or the type of mentorship you have. Is it the case that right, just having more mentors actually predicts that you get more financing from VCs versus other sources, something like that? Maybe there's something there to try to think about if that's a different channel. The last big thing is that I would love to see more heterogeneity beyond the high versus low learner, kind of that split above and below median final precision. Partially because I think that split is a little bit confusing to me just because it's kind of splitting on the outcome, but more specifically, I think that there's a lot of richness in the data that could kind of help disentangle some stories. Now, it's not a huge sample, so it might very well be that there's not enough power here, in which case, it is what it is. But for instance, you could look and see whether the results are different by what share of your founders don't have business degrees. Maybe those groups have more to learn about the kind of business aspects of forming a startup and getting it up and going. On the mentorship side, you can look in whether or not the mentors themselves were formerly successful entrepreneurs versus if they're more on the kind of VC track. Maybe they have different lessons to teach, things like that. And so kind of exploring those sorts of dimensions, I think would be really helpful. On the high versus low learner, I think one thing that trips me up a little bit is that the low learners kind of tend to have higher performance. And so it's like the low learners end up being the more precise. Low learners are the ones who have the below median final, terminal precision, and yet they end up being having higher average performance in the long run. And so I don't quite know how to square that away with the other results. A couple of final things that I'll just mention. I'll skip the first one. The second thing is that this was kind of briefly mentioned in the methodology. I would be really curious to see what the results look like for the link between mentorship and precision without the startup fixed effects in there, because the current interpretation, right, is that we want to control for startup fixed effects when we think about, within basically some startups are going to be more or less precise on average. And then we're going to basically think about within a startup, when are they more precise? Is it after they've had more cumulative mentorship hours? But I find it a little bit difficult to then map that over to the mentorship performance relationship. So, the end goal is to try to really parse out what's explaining the kind of relationship between more mentorship hours and higher performance. That's ultimately a cross startup comparison, but then the kind of relationship between mentorship and precision is done at a within mentorship and within startup rather comparison. And so it's a little bit difficult to kind of compare across those two. The last, or I guess number 3 here, is I don't think you're doing it. Maybe I missed it. I would have thought that you'd want to control for the total number of past mentors in the sense of looking at comparing startups who have similar possible sets of former mentors out there, and then some of them just happen to have more of those former mentors show up to kind of try to control for popularity. Maybe that's kind of taken into account with the startup fixed effects, but in those regressions, and maybe I missed something, but I would have thought I would have done that. And then the last thing is that if there's any sort of data that you can get on this, it'd be really interesting. And this was kind of brought up a little bit in the question before of how sustained these lessons are. In some ways you could have taken these results and say, okay, the program is doing what it's meant to be doing. It's teaching, it's really shaping that prioritization in those first couple of months. Does that mean that you're ready to then go on and you're going to be super, is your trajectory forever changed? Or is it just that you've kind of got things right at the very beginning? And so kind of does the slope of performance change over time, based on your mentorship? I think it would be really interesting. I don't know if you have data on it. So that's another thing to look at. With that, I'll just say thank you. Amir, we can email or chat more offline, but otherwise, great job.
Great. Thanks so much, Melanie. Amir, you got a few minutes. Do you want to respond to anything that Melanie said? Or we can see if anyone has some questions, and feel free to unmute yourself after Amir's done chatting.
I just want to start with thanking Melanie for, first of all, the great feedback. I've got 2.5 pages of notes so far, and she has sent me even more notes via email. So thank you very much for that. There are a lot of great suggestions here, but maybe I'll just address 2 points. One was the first point that Melanie raised, which is an important one, which is that how do we interpret correct? Well, we don't have the optimal objective that the entrepreneur should focus on. We don't have that. The benchmark here is people who have seen and mentored and worked with and invested in, a variety of startups. So to the extent that you care about being ex-entrepreneur, investing in startups, that is our benchmark. However, that doesn't address the point. There's another project I'm working on with Ramananda and Stephen Hansen, where we actually we focus exactly on that. What are the optimal tests or objectives to tackle with important business challenges that early startups usually face? So that is one point that I thought was great and should be addressed directly in the paper. The other point that you mentioned was about source of financing. We do expect that there are benefits attributed as a result of this connection with mentors, getting exposure and possibly getting more funding in the future. We do have some data on that, but as you can imagine, some of these deals are highly classified, and there's only so much I can do in terms of calling the people. Some of them don't pick up the phone, and if I keep calling them, they're going to get super angry. So we have data on some of the details of these investment deals, but not on all of them. But again, this is a great point. I think we can at least work with the data that we have and see if see what we find there. There are a lot of other points. Again, I want to maybe a chance to everybody to ask questions, but thank you again, Melanie. These are fantastic comments.